A cold dawn wind sweeps across an isolated stretch of ranch land just outside Billings, Montana. Nearly 400 acres of barbed wire and pasture lie frozen under a pale sunrise. For 3 generations, this dirt was bloodline. Everyone thought they knew exactly how this legacy would end. But when the lawyer finally unsealed that envelope, the truth paralyzed the room, because every single acre, every cattle contract, and every last dollar went to a total stranger. Woodrow Guthrie Sr. built this empire from absolutely nothing. He bled into this hard Montana soil for decades to forge something that mattered. Locals described him as stubborn, deeply proud, and utterly relentless. By his 40s, he had violently dragged a tiny leased plot into a massive cattle operation spanning hundreds of acres. He and his wife raised 3 seemingly loyal children right there on the property. For decades, Woodrow promised a simple plan. When he died, they would split it all equally. Believing him was their first mistake. 3 kids, 3 even shares. No shocking twists. But the final draft of his will revealed a devastating, calculated lie. When the document was read, every single asset belonged to just one person, Caroline Renee Guthrie. And here is the detail that absolutely shattered the room. Caroline was not one of the children raised in that house. In fact, until that exact second, nobody had ever heard her name. How did a complete ghost manage to hijack a massive ranching empire? And what horrifying secret had Woodrow Guthrie Sr. been burying for almost 30 years? Before we dive into the wreckage, tell me something in the comments below. Should parents split inheritances fairly, or do whatever they want, even if it leaves an open wound that destroys a family forever? 1940s Montana was a brutal landscape for making money. The land swallowing Billings was vast, rough, and completely unforgiving. Winters were endless. Summers demanded brutal, bone-breaking hours under the sun. Families survived purely on sheer grit. This was the harsh, unforgiving world Woodrow Guthrie Sr. inherited at birth. His father broke his back for the railroad. Steady pay, but absolutely zero actual financial security. His mother kept them alive by washing clothes and tending a massive garden. Locals joked she was single-handedly feeding half the county. They were dead broke, barely scraping by. But anyone investigating the Guthrie family's past found one undeniable trait: a dangerous, quiet pride. The kind that stubbornly refuses a lifeline even while actively drowning. Childhood friends testified that Woodrow carried that exact same rigid stubbornness. If something snapped, he alone fixed it. He finished every grueling job. One neighbor simply described him as a kid, pathologically incapable of ever giving up. By the time Woodrow hit his early 20s, that fierce obsession was forging his path. At 23, he scraped up enough cash to lease 30 acres outside Billings. It was nothing but dead grass and rotting fences. But it was his start, and he had absolutely zero safety net. Every piece of rusted equipment was borrowed. The mechanical failures were relentless. He labored from pitch-black mornings into dead nights. Those early cattle contracts were desperately fragile and constantly at risk. Slowly, the dirt empire grew. 30 acres became 80. 80 became 200. By his mid-40s, it was a 400-acre monster. With herds swarming over once dead land, neighbors stopped using road names to describe the area's boundaries. They simply called it the Guthrie Ranch. In 1966, Woodrow married Margaret Ella Hooper, a local teacher known for eerie patience and a disarming laugh. Witnesses to their life together always mention Margaret's laughter first. It could completely disarm a room and mask the darkest days. Together, they projected the absolute perfect version of the American dream. They raised 3 seemingly happy kids right on that property. Woodrow Jr., known as Dell, was the golden boy. He bled for that land right alongside his father. Thomas, the middle son, forged his own path. The youngest, Patricia, became a teacher just like her beloved mother. To outside observers, the Guthries were an unbreakable fortress. The sprawling land, the massive house on the hill, the endless cattle moving like clockwork every single morning. But investigators of his past noticed a dark red flag. Woodrow was virtually incapable of expressing real emotion. He showed love through brutal labor. By building a fortress, by holding the purse strings tight, but honest conversations, he buried those deep in the dirt. That pathological silence, evidence suggests, became the weapon that destroyed them. But nobody knew yet. For decades, the lie quietly expanded. Deals were solidified. That sprawling soil held its worth. But the true fracture happened in 2003, the year Margaret passed. Friends spotted the shadow instantly. Woodrow worked the dirt. His punishing routine never wavered. The herd still drifted across frost-covered pastures at dawn. Yet the man guiding them had gone ice-cold, drifting impossibly far. And somewhere in the dark years following Margaret's passing, hiding it from his kids, Woodrow Guthrie began carrying a secret, a hidden truth poised to shred his final testament and fracture their future. But nobody knew yet. Surviving a Montana cattle empire is far from the cinematic dream outsiders picture. From the highway, the isolation looks breathtaking. Endless skies, dead silent dawns, livestock roaming the plains, but the brutal reality is never a peaceful escape. It is vicious weather snapping without mercy. It is crippling debt stalking every land grab. It is economies evaporating in a single, unforgiving season. Surviving the dirt demands iron patience, dangerous gambles, and a stomach for absolute dread. Woodrow Guthrie was forged for that grueling survival. Hitting his mid-40s, the tiny dirt patch he initially rented had mutated into a multi-million-dollar behemoth. Ruthless agreements with regional buyers ensured his livestock bled seamlessly into massive corporate supply lines. Machinery upgraded. Barbed wire pushed aggressively past the boundaries. His reckless gamble, fueled by sheer grit, had hardened into a deeply lucrative empire. Anchoring this sprawling compound was the imposing manor Woodrow erected on the ridge, watching over it all, boasting a massive porch staring down at the livestock. Its heavy stone hearth fought off lethal, freezing Montana winters. To the isolated locals scattered across the valley, that fortress became an undeniable monument. Locals navigating back roads never used street names anymore. They just pointed travelers straight toward the looming Guthrie compound. Inside those walls, the three siblings harbored a silent, deadly assumption about their inheritance. Del, the eldest son, shadowed his father's every step. Growing up, he mastered the barbed wire, tracked the herds, and bled for the brutal daily grind. Everyone assumed he was the heir apparent. But the second sibling made the first mistake, walking away. Fleeing to Seattle after graduation, he forged a lucrative, disconnected life in corporate consulting, only ghosting back for mandatory holidays. Sister Patricia carved out her own separate escape. Chasing her late mother's ghost, she pivoted into teaching. They scattered to the wind, bound by one silent, incredibly dangerous, widely accepted assumption. Someday, the empire would be theirs. Woodrow himself had fed them that exact promise, over and over, for decades. Evidence suggested by those dwelling in their inner circle, he swore the massive estate would be split equally when he died. 3 kids, 3 cuts. But that promise was a lie. But after Margaret passed in 2003, close friends spotted an unnerving darkness creeping into Woodrow. He still aggressively worked the massive property. The grind never shifted patrolling fields at dawn, burying himself in ledgers by dusk, clinging to the militant rhythm defining his existence. But a chilling shift occurred. Neighbors whispered about clipped sentences. His ringing phone slowly went dead silent. Haunting local town halls, his eyes would glaze over, tracking an invisible ghost nobody else could spot. It felt like a fractured piece of his psyche had locked itself in a dark room, permanently shutting the door. Years down the line, Del would desperately retrace his steps, agonizing over tiny, terrifying red flags. Unexplained solo trips into the abyss, hours lost on the road with zero alibi. Hushed phone calls slammed down whenever a shadow approached. In the moment, it all felt harmless. Woodrow was always a notoriously guarded phantom. His kids were trained to never dig into his shadows. But looking back at the wreckage, those fleeting moments practically screamed. One afternoon changed everything. In summer 2019, 2 years before his demise, Del stumbled upon a detail that froze his blood. His father had quietly retained a brand new attorney. It absolutely wasn't Franklin Morse, the trusted legal bulldog who guarded their secrets for over 20 years. This was an unfamiliar predator, a slick Billings shark exploiting a broken legal system, specializing in the wreckage of contested inheritances. Del desperately tried to brush it off as routine paperwork, but the undeniable dread had already taken root. Because if the old man was secretly rewriting his legacy, the sprawling empire they bled for was suddenly in the crosshairs. The initial crack in the foundation appeared in the dead heat of 2019. It disguised itself as a minor footnote, an easily ignored detail. Then Dell discovered his father's covert meetings with a Billings attorney, a stranger completely bypassing Franklin Morse, the loyal fixture who buried Guthrie family secrets for over 20 years. Someone always knows. According to public records, this fresh-faced downtown attorney specialized in estate restructuring and violently contested inheritances. Dell spotted these meetings because his father was a man of strict routine. That was the first mistake. Family legal matters exclusively went through Franklin. That system had been carved in stone for decades. Breaking that pattern felt deeply wrong, but Dell brushed off the creeping dread, a decision he would soon regret. Later that week, Dell phoned his brother Thomas in Seattle about the whispers. Thomas reacted with easy, blind confidence. "Dad is probably just updating the will," Thomas insisted. "He does that every few years." On paper, that logic seemed flawless. Aging men rewrite their legacies all the time. Yet Dell could not shake the chilling feeling that a darker secret was brewing. Over the following months, tiny, seemingly harmless details began to paint a deeply disturbing picture. Unmarked certified letters began arriving at the family home, raising quiet alarms. Papers vanished into locked drawers. Once, a mysterious caller ID flashed before Woodrow slammed his phone face down. Taken alone, none of these isolated fragments proved a thing, but the puzzle pieces were gathering, and the Guthrie family code was absolute. You never ask direct questions about private affairs. Secrets were meant to surface in their own time. So Dell waited 2 agonizing years while life stubbornly played out as normal. Cattle roamed the pastures. Contracts were quietly signed. The seasons washed over the isolated Montana hills. Then, on the morning of March 4th, 2021, the clock stopped. Woodrow Guthrie died at 81 inside the house he built. Dell watched it happen. Thomas had flown in days prior, alerted that their father was rapidly fading. Patricia drove through the dead of night from Missoula, arriving hours after the patriarch took his final breath. The funeral mirrored Woodrow strictly, small and whisper quiet. A modest service at the local Methodist church. They buried him on the ranch by the cottonwood trees, exactly where he used to drink his morning coffee. Neighbors paid respects. Loyal hands lingered silently at the back. A few old friends who knew the man before his empire gathered, retreating to the ranch house after the dirt settled. Hushed voices filled the living room. Half-empty coffee cups littered the sprawling kitchen counters. The atmosphere was heavy but deceptively calm, until Franklin Morse pulled Dell aside just hours after the burial. The old family attorney asked for a strictly private word. A chill filled the room. They slipped into a dim, quiet hallway, far from the grieving crowd's muffled chatter. Franklin knew how to deliver devastating news, but evidence suggested he was terrified that afternoon. "Your father visited me last year," he began. Dell froze. Franklin chose his next words deliberately. He had been made aware of a shadow document, filed completely off the books. A knot formed in Dell's stomach. A document for what? Franklin hesitated. A codicil. That single word sucked the oxygen from the hallway. A codicil was not a brand new will. It was a legal weapon. An amendment designed to quietly gut an existing estate plan. To what? Dell managed to ask. Franklin stared right through him. It was an amendment to the will dividing the empire equally among the 3 children. Dell lost his voice. Then, Franklin delivered the crushing blow that would haunt the family for years. "There is a new document," the attorney whispered, "and it changes absolutely everything." 6 days later, on a bleak Tuesday morning, the siblings gathered in Franklin's sterile conference room. Dell was the first to arrive. Thomas walked in next, alongside his wife, Alina. Patricia slipped in last, taking the farthest seat in complete silence. Not a single one of them grasped the nightmare they were about to step into. But the central mystery was ticking. In mere minutes, the father they loved would become a stranger. Franklin opened the meeting with agonizing routine, laying out the document they all expected. He cracked open the original will. The legal jargon was perfectly standard. According to court records, Woodrow signed away his empire in 3 perfectly equal cuts. The fortune was staggering. Over 460 acres of prime ranch land sitting just outside Billings. It included lucrative livestock contracts, heavy machinery, and an entire fleet of vehicles. Along with massive operating assets, the investment accounts alone hovered right above $3 million. Every single penny, under the original plan, belonged evenly to Dell, Thomas, and Patricia. For one fleeting second, the room felt safe. The future they had banked on was unfolding without a single hitch. Then Franklin slid a second, fatal document across the table. He paused, and the trap finally snapped shut. "This," the attorney murmured with chilling precision, "is an amendment your father quietly filed 14 months ago. Just a handful of pages. But those crisp sheets held massive legal weight, executed in absolute accordance with Montana statute. Witnessed, notarized, officially stamped by the county, and devastatingly, it rendered his original last will completely null and void." Franklin pushed his spectacles up, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "Under this new document, every asset, the sprawling acreage, the ancestral home, the livestock, heavy machinery, and bank accounts, all of it diverted to one solitary heir, Caroline Renee Guthrie, 34 years old, a resident of Spokane, Washington." The room went dead silent. Nobody recognized the name, but this phantom woman had just stolen their birthright. Then came the fatal blow. The attorney confirmed the impossible. Caroline was Woodrow's flesh and blood. The evidence lay in a covert DNA panel Woodrow secretly commissioned in 2018, exactly 3 years before his death. The lab results sat right there in the probate file. Dell physically gasped for air. Thomas slumped backward against the leather upholstery, his eyes burning a hole through the mahogany table. Patricia simply turned away. She stared at the bruised gray clouds looming over Billings, paralyzed in absolute silence. According to court records, that suffocating quiet dragged on for several excruciating minutes. This was not the silence of mere outrage. It was the crushing gravity of a family realizing their entire legacy was built on a lie. But nobody knew the half of it yet. Within 7 days, the siblings declared all-out legal warfare. Retaining high-powered counsel, Dell launched a vicious lawsuit to invalidate the document. Their strategy hinged on two desperate theories. First, they claimed sinister coercion. They painted Caroline as a predator, manipulating an aging, vulnerable widower into signing away his empire. Second, they weaponized his mind, pleading diminished capacity. Evidence suggested the patriarch was severely compromised when he signed, but that defense was about to hit a massive brick wall. Clinical charts proved Woodrow possessed a razor-sharp intellect well into his late 70s. His primary physician testified under oath. Zero signs of dementia during the exact window the paperwork was executed. To make matters worse, the drafting attorney had kept damningly precise logs of every single consultation. Those files proved Woodrow acted with chilling clarity. No coercion, no confusion. Just a man determined to quietly rewrite his legacy. From a judicial standpoint, the document was bulletproof. Piece by piece, the siblings' entire case crumbled to dust. A judge swiftly threw out the lawsuit. The estate would be handled precisely as the dead man commanded. The ancestral ranch, the sprawling acres of blood and sweat that had anchored the Guthrie dynasty for generations, it all belonged to a ghost they never knew existed. So, at this stage of the investigation, I have to ask, what chills you more? The revelation of a secret heir? Or the cold-blooded choice to give her everything? Drop your theories below, because while the justice system had closed the book, the darkest piece of Woodrow's puzzle was still hiding in plain sight. The truth would finally crawl out of the shadows months later, not inside a pristine courtroom, but tucked inside a decaying leather Bible, left untouched on a study shelf. 7 months post-mortem, the grim task of clearing the property dragged on. Vibrant living spaces had transformed into stagnant tombs, overflowing with mountains of neglected paperwork. Faded Polaroids and lifetimes of hoarded trinkets sat untouched. Nobody could stomach the emotional toll of digging through the wreckage. Dell actively avoided his father's study for months. It was a psychological minefield. This was Woodrow's inner sanctum, the space where he balanced ledgers, penned correspondence, and stared out into the darkness after brutal days outdoors. Finally, a hired hand named Gerald stepped in to clear the bookshelves, and that was his first mistake. Slipped into the pages of Margaret's antique Bible was a solitary, sealed envelope. The frantic scrawl across the paper belonged undeniably to Woodrow, addressed simply to Dell, Thomas, and Patricia. It held zero evidentiary weight in probate court. No binding legal authority, no stiff, bureaucratic jargon, just a devastating confession, the missing puzzle piece that would finally explain the carnage he left behind. Patricia later told a local reporter that the contents shattered their reality. It held a secret so toxic, It rewrote their childhood. Woodrow knew about his hidden daughter decades ago, long before his wife passed away. He had swallowed that guilt, burying it deep. Caroline was the product of a fleeting, illicit affair, a monumental scandal he fought desperately to keep out of the public eye. The moment he confirmed her existence, the patriarch made a calculated choice, one that would poison the next 20 years. He chose absolute silence. According to the letter, he was terrified the truth would rip his perfect family to shreds. Margaret was still breathing. Evidence suggested Woodrow was terrified the absolute truth would destroy her final, fragile years. When she finally passed, the lies had calcified. But nobody knew yet. He was paralyzed by how the dark truth might corrupt his children's memories. So he buried the bodies deep. The agonizing years dragged on. The toxic secret survived, but a haunting letter proved he remained obsessed with his missing phantom daughter. Patricia later detailed this chilling passage. His final words completely shattered the case. The staggering inheritance, he insisted, was never meant as a vicious weapon. It was a desperate attempt to settle a massive, rotting debt. Because Caroline Renee Guthrie grew up miles away from that bloody Montana dirt, she was raised in Spokane by her mother, Diane Vasquez, a woman who briefly worked at a Billings feed store back in the late 1980s. Records show Diane scraped together a fiercely quiet, totally ordinary life, raising Caroline completely in the shadows. For decades, Caroline only possessed shattered fragments of her true bloodline. Her mother eventually confessed her real father was a Montana rancher, just a fleeting, catastrophic mistake, but the rest was a terrifying black hole. Strangely, Caroline never hunted for the truth. Instead, the phantom hunted her. In 2017, Woodrow hired a private investigator to track down Diane. It took mere weeks to lock onto the unaware targets. He penned 3 desperate handwritten pages. Using a middleman, he begged for a single face-to-face meeting. She hesitated for 6 agonizing weeks. They finally met in January 2018 at a bleak Spokane diner. He drove 14 grueling hours. Legal filings claim he arrived early, gripped his black coffee, and just waited. Whatever sinister truth was shared in that booth remains a total mystery. Caroline fiercely refused every interview request. But over the next 2 years, a deeply complex bond festered. It was not a normal father and daughter dynamic, but it was dangerously real. They shared hushed calls and intense visits. They dissected an entire lifetime of agonizing missing pieces. Methodically, they forged a deep, quiet tie, a bond buried alive for over 30 long years. The chilling letter proved these secret rendezvous shattered his comfortable delusions. He had built a massive empire. He raised 3 legitimate heirs. Yet another daughter existed, completely exiled from that kingdom. That guilt devoured him alive. Patricia later admitted the deathbed confession flipped the entire investigation upside down. Initially, there was blinding rage, absolute betrayal. She thought the shocking will was a final act of cruelty. But after reading his ghost-written confession, the narrative completely shifted. It was never really about punishing us, she testified during the fallout. It was a rotting guilt he swallowed for decades. He was just a dying man trying to balance the grim scales. By early 2022, the brutal litigation died. The courts validated the will, and the empire officially shifted hands. For the very first time, the blood-stained Guthrie soil claimed a totally new master, Caroline Renee Guthrie. With a single judge's stroke, the family's legacy plunged into absolute, terrifying darkness. Spring crawls into Montana. The vast, empty acreage sits frozen beneath a dead, pale sky. Frail cottonwood branches scrape against the harsh wind. Cattle roam across the exact dirt Woodrow bled for. Fence by broken fence, lie by lie. Out on the porch, Caroline Renee Guthrie stands completely alone, just holding a black coffee. The wooden deck wraps around the house, the exact spot where Woodrow once watched the sun illuminate 400 stolen acres. For decades, this massive property was nothing more than a chilling ghost story. Now, she owns every single blade of grass. Meanwhile, the original heirs have been permanently scattered into the wind. Dell and Thomas are basically estranged. Their bond with Patricia has dissolved into an eerie, suffocating silence. The sprawling ranch is still there. The barbed wire remains untouched. The isolated land keeps its slow, unforgiving pace. But the family that once bled for it has been completely wiped off the map. Woodrow loved his children, but he harbored a toxic secret that infected every single one of them. He finally shattered 30 years of agonizing silence using a legally binding document, a haunting voice from the grave that absolutely no one could silence. Was it actual justice or just the bitter math of human regret? That is a final verdict you will have to reach on your own. If this dark case haunted you, leave your verdict below to honor the victims destroyed by their own twisted family trees. Leave your verdict below. Because what Woodrow Guthrie did wasn't just a legal maneuver, it was a detonation. Set on a 30-year fuse, he built a dynasty with his bare hands. He raised 3 children on that Montana dirt. And then, in the final act of his life, he rewrote the entire story. Not out of cruelty, not out of greed, but out of something far more devastating, a guilt that outlasted every sunrise he ever watched from that porch. That is the part that truly haunts this case. Because the villain here doesn't fit the mold. He wasn't calculating or cold-blooded. He was a man who made one catastrophic mistake in the late 80s, buried it under 40 years of silence, and carried it alone into his grave. But silence always has a price. And in the Guthrie family, that price was paid by 3 children who spent their entire lives trusting a promise that was already broken. Dell bled for that land every single day. He shadowed his father through brutal Montana winters, believing the dirt beneath his boots would someday be his. Thomas walked away from that empire and built a separate life, trusting the promise would hold regardless. Patricia taught children how to read and write, living quietly inside a future she believed was guaranteed. None of them ever imagined the inheritance wasn't real. Not because Woodrow was dishonest by nature, but because he was too proud and too afraid to ever tell the truth. That is the most devastating inheritance of all. Not the land, not the money, not the cattle contracts, or the stone hearth, or the 400 acres of frozen Montana pasture. It is the silence. The silence that grows quietly in the space between what a man promises and what he actually does. And Caroline Renee Guthrie stands on that porch now, holding a black coffee, staring at land she never asked for and never knew existed. She didn't steal this empire. She didn't manipulate a dying man. She simply answered a letter from a stranger who turned out to be her father. And that truth, the pure, unfiltered reality of her story, is what makes this case so utterly impossible to resolve with a clean verdict. Because every person in this story was wronged. Dell, Thomas, and Patricia lost a legacy. Caroline lost 30 years of a father she never got to know. And Woodrow Guthrie died carrying the weight of both betrayals, the one he committed against his family and the one he committed against himself. That is what secrets do. They don't stay buried forever. They just wait. They wait for the exact moment when the man holding them can no longer hold on. And then they surface not quietly, not gently, but in a sterile conference room, across a mahogany table, in a document that redraws the entire map of a family's life. The dirt is still there. The barbed wire is still standing. The cattle still drift across those frost-covered pastures every morning at dawn. But the family that bled for it is gone. And a stranger stands in their place, not as a villain, but as the living proof of a secret 30 years in the making. So tell me, drop it in the comments right now. Was this justice? Or was it punishment disguised as guilt? Because in cases like this, those two things look almost identical from the outside, and only the dead man knows the difference. If this story shook you, if the weight of it is still sitting in your chest, share it, because the Guthrie family is not the only family hiding a sealed envelope somewhere in an old Bible. There are more Woodrows out there, more Dells, more Carolines waiting for a letter from a stranger, more families one document away from losing everything they were promised. And the only thing more dangerous than a secret kept for 30 years is a world that pretends those secrets don't exist. Hit subscribe, trigger those notifications, and stay with us because the next case is already waiting in the shadows, and it is darker than this one.